I've made quite a few videos about hypothetical rosters for video games. I've already done the big one everyone likes to speculate on, Super Smash Bros., twice, so I figure it's finally time to do my own spin on the roster for the other big hype series everybody wants to speculate on, Marvel vs. Capcom. I love this series and the idea of it coming back, so here's my proposal for Marvel vs. Capcom 4. Well, of course, it's actually Marvel vs. Capcom 5 and arguably Marvel vs. Capcom 7, but everyone just collectively decided to call a hypothetical next game Marvel vs. Capcom 4, so I will do that as well. Just to make sure everyone's on the same page about this concept, Marvel vs. Capcom is a fighting game pitting together characters from Marvel Comics and Capcom video games. It's a long-running and really iconic series with high-flying gameplay and huge attacks that fill up a whole screen. Unsurprisingly, it's a series that's got a whole bunch of hype around the releases, which is very apparent when you see the amount of buzz it got when the game's got a big collection coming later this year. The latest release, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which is the actual Marvel vs. Capcom 4, was a bit of a disappointment on the roster front since they didn't have the rights to X-Men characters. This was back when Disney didn't own them, and it just felt a little too much like MCU shilling. I mean, Winter Soldier is a character you pull out when you want people buying tickets to movies, you know? The fanbase almost unanimously does not consider Infinite the actual Marvel vs. Capcom 4 anymore. The point of me saying all this is to highlight the direction a hypothetical Marvel vs. Capcom 4 would have to take, bringing back a lot of beloved characters and getting people hyped over something like this. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and 3 were probably the most beloved games in this series, so a lot of attention would have to be brought to their characters as well. This means I'll be sure to bring back lots of legacy characters, and while the Marvel movies themselves are a good blueprint to figure out what Marvel characters are really popular, it's always a good idea to use characters who are more well known for their comic book appearances, so it doesn't just feel like we're shilling the movies. We also need lots of X-Men. X-Men are cool. I'll be sure to keep that in mind as I make my roster. It's also a good idea to have some fun with it and add some more obscure characters or weirder picks. Nobody wants a boring roster. Marvel as a brand has changed a lot since 2017 when Infinite came out, so there's plenty of new directions to go here, really. Capcom's a bit easier, but still a challenge. So really, I'll just try to make this game as exciting as possible for this series' big return. Do keep in mind that there's no objective way to make a roster like this. There may be some picks you don't really like, and that's fine. I can't exactly please everyone here. We're having some fun, and of course I welcome your own ideas in the comments too. This collaborative nature is what I really like about doing rosters like this. For the base game, I've got 22 roster slots for both sides, for a full roster of 44. I'll explain each pick as I go along. I imagine this is going to be a pretty long video because of that, and so I'll just start this damn thing already. Subscribe if you enjoy this, and I actually did previously do a roster about what Marvel vs. Capcom would have been like if it had released in 1994, with the team-based structure of the King of Fighters series, so do check that out as well afterwards if you like this. It differs quite a bit from my picks here. Starting off, the very first character on the Marvel side is Spider-Man. Quite obvious, as he's easily Marvel's most recognizable character, and it almost feels like the Marvel vs. Capcom version of him is iconic in his own right. He even did get a cameo in a Spider-Verse comic at one point where he died for some reason. My second character also comes from the Spider-Man comics, so I'll unveil him right now, Dr. Octopus. The Marvel vs. Capcom games have kinda always struggled with representing Spider-Man villains. Venom was in them ever since the first game, but another Spidey villain who's more of an actual bad guy and less of an anti-hero hasn't really happened yet. Which is especially notable when Spider-Man's rogues gallery is one of the greatest in fiction ever. Doc Ock is one of the most well-known Spider-Man villains. He always seems to have a really interesting dynamic with Peter, and he actually was considered for a spot in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but wasn't added because his robotic arms proved too challenging to program. Now that the technology is a little bit better, I say that those robot arms could make for a really interesting moveset. Doc Ock could probably be a zoner, able to grab enemies and keep them back with his robot arms. So there's our two Spider-Man characters. We also kind of have to include the Miles Morales incarnation of Spider-Man as a costume for Peter as well. It's easy to make that a costume that changes his suit to the Miles Morales version, but Miles is so big now that it might actually work better if we steal the premier costume idea from Injustice and make Miles Morales Spider-Man a costume for Spider-Man that actually changes his voice lines while keeping his moveset intact. I don't really have any other premier costume ideas, but I guess I could figure one out once we get to the Capcom side. I haven't thought out premier costumes that well, but they're an idea I see tossed around for an MVC game a lot, and it's an easy way to sneak in another character who I couldn't find room for anyways. My next two Marvel characters come from the universe of Fantastic Four. Nobody from the Fantastic Four made it into Infinite, but it was less of a priority in complaints about the Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite roster than the X-Men were. I mean, for one, a Fantastic Four was never even in any of the games before. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 strategically chose to add Super Skrull, since he has the powers of all four Fantastic Four members, but here I think it's time to finally add one proper. My choice is The Thing. I selected him in particular because more heavyweights on this roster would be cool, and there totally won't be any characters with stretchy powers later on, rendering Mr. Fantastic redundant if I were to add him. The next Fantastic Four character is their biggest villain, Doctor Doom. Like Spider-Man, he's a character who almost took a life of his own in the MVC games, with moves and mannerisms that are very distinct and iconic, and I haven't added that many villains in the roster as we go on, so he feels like a must. Let's take a look back at Capcom for the next four characters. These four come from one franchise, Street Fighter. Not Capcom's biggest franchise, but definitely their main fighting game series and easily the one Capcom series with the most characters in Marvel vs. Capcom. I've added Ryu, Chun-Li, Juri, and Luke. Ryu and Chun-Li are the obvious picks, they always get into crossovers, and are probably the two most iconic characters from Street Fighter. I figure I could also do the obvious pick and add Ken as a premier costume for Ryu if we're doing premier costumes now. Juri is a pretty popular character Capcom has been pushing a lot lately. I figure they could probably ease up on him a bit now, since she's clearly an established character and was on the base roster of Street Fighter 6, but she hasn't really gotten a chance to be in Marvel vs. Capcom, so sure. Then Luke was the face of Street Fighter 6, and after a bit of a rocky, spaghetti-haired start, he proved to be very popular and a positive example of fighting games introducing a new generation character. I love the idea of putting him into a crossover. Going back to Marvel a little bit, this character is also technically from the Fantastic Four universe, but I consider him to be his own thing, really. Black Bolt. He's the king of a race of superpowered individuals hidden away from society called the Inhumans. A superhero team that's had a rough time in adaptations, their show was bad, their movie got cancelled, and many people started resenting them when they were pushed hard in the comics as replacements for the X-Men. They did sort of get a redemption arc with Black Bolt's appearance in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I really enjoyed his role in the movie, and I feel the characters work best in crossovers. Probably because Black Bolt is mute. He attacks with deadly sound waves, which could mostly make up his moveset here, and we could take some inspiration from Black Canary and Injustice for the moveset. In a similar vein to how Black Bolt is technically a Fantastic Four character, Mike Hagar from Final Fight is next. Technically a Street Fighter character, from a certain point of view, I guess. Final Fight has had a long history of being connected to Street Fighter, and even though he wasn't in any of the games, Hagar is the only character to have been playable in the entire Final Fight trilogy, even already making a couple of Marvel vs. Capcom appearances. A few of his moves were later used by Zangief in the Street Fighter games, which makes Hagar quite the formidable grappler, but he also has the ability to utilize some of the classic beat-em-up weapons from Final Fight, like iron pipes or barrels, which makes him a pretty interesting fighter. Also more heavyweight representation again, that's cool. Moving on to characters associated with the Avengers, Captain America and the Hulk are next. They're pretty obvious picks who are mainstays of these games. And then, here comes the part I actually need to explain. War Machine. But Iron Man is not making it onto the roster. Okay, part of this is to reference the first Marvel vs. Capcom game. Rhodey was there without Tony Stark, but it also has to do with the final boss of this game. See, my concept for the final boss of this game is to have Superior Iron Man as the boss. Superior Iron Man is an evil variant of Tony Stark. He's just an interesting character I would like to see come back as a villain of a crossover like this, and he could make some giant robots for an interesting final boss. Seeing him pull the strings in the story mode would be cool if we do get to do one as well, and it would be a fresh new idea while still referencing the variants and multiverse of the current MCU. And plus, Iron Man is famously dead there. I absolutely don't want to stick to the movies for my roster, but they can be inspiration for some of the picks. And by the way, this decision was made before Robert Downey Jr. was cast as Doctor Doom in the MCU. Honestly, the fact that an evil Iron Man already exists in the comics is one of the big problems I had with that reveal, so here I get to take a slightly passive-aggressive jab at the MCU by adapting Superior Iron Man and doing something interesting with War Machine, unlike them. Let's be real, Iron Man would likely be DLC now, so War Machine would likely have to have a different moveset to him. Superior Iron Man could probably be a premier costume of regular Iron Man, so we can get the boss in as a playable character. Anyways, next up is Thor. He's a big part of the Avengers and does not need a giant paragraph justifying his addition this time. Back to Capcom. X and Zero for Mega Man are my next choices. Zero has been a mainstay of this series ever since Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and X, who is the protagonist of the Mega Man X series but not quite as popular as Zero, came to Infinite, which was one of the really interesting roster decisions that they made. However, I've actually decided to add the Mega Man Zero incarnation of Zero instead of the more familiar version for Mega Man X. It's just a cool take on the character, and it has gone into crossovers before, namely Onimusha Blade Warriors and SNK vs. Capcom SVC Chaos, but not Marvel vs. Capcom, so let's get him in a crossover that wasn't extremely weird. That was the fourth time I mentioned Onimusha Blade Warriors on this channel without actually talking about it, by the way. I don't know why I mentioned that, it's just odd. If I was adding regular old Mega Man X Zero, I would have also had the classic version of Mega Man, but since I'm not, X here represents the Mega Man X series. They're followed by two characters coming from Darkstalkers. It's an older Capcom fighting game series about monsters that basically just lives on through crossovers now, and is a mainstay of Marvel vs. Capcom games. First is Morrigan. She's the face of the series, and almost always the first choice for crossovers like this. Afterwards, I added BB Hood. Her deal is that she's Little Red Riding Hood but a mercenary, sweet at first until she pulls out a bunch of guns and grenades and slits your throat. I didn't have very many actual villains in the base roster, so that's part of what compelled me to choose her in particular. She's also just a really fun character for something like this. She was previously in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, so it would be cool to see her return and get the luxury of having more than one character model. Speaking of character models, I think this is a good time to take a little bit of a detour and talk about this game's art style. So I want this game to have a comic book aesthetic, but my own personal preferred look would be to have bright models reminiscent of the style Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was going for, rather than the darker look of Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which was reminiscent of 2000s comic books. The cel-shaded models for the characters in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, in the mod that Maximilian Dood commissioned and Wistful Hopes created, could present a very good model for how to do this. They're absolutely gorgeous, and all I could ever ask for in a new Marvel vs. Capcom game art style-wise. Plus, they were based on Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite models, so there's nothing stopping Capcom from reusing models and assets and still making them look new and interesting. Loki is next. He's Thor's brother and the longest running villain of the Avengers in both the comics and the movies. He's never been in a Marvel vs. Capcom game though. His trickery and general illusions can make him stand out a lot, and they've added another villain on the Capcom side, Devilot from the Cyberpod series. It's a fairly obscure fighting game about warriors who fight in mechs, whose protagonist Jin Sotome got into some older Marvel vs. Capcom games. Devilot is a popular character though, and a nice way of reintroducing the Cyberbot series to Marvel vs. Capcom. Now, she might have some overlap with BB Hood, who's literally right next to her on this roster, since she's sort of similar. She's also an innocent, blonde, young girl, but actually a sadistic villain. Devilot is still quite different, if done well though, since her fighting style is distinct, and she's more of an actual villain instead of just a mercenary. She could probably use her mechs for attacks, and even summon henchmen for some moves. Another magician follows Loki, it's Scarlet Witch. She's sort of most known for being an Avenger because of the movies, although she was created as a villain of the X-Men. She's also had a villainous role in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, so I suppose we can consider her an anti-hero. She would probably use more outright magic attacks rather than illusions like Loki. Batsu is next. He's a character from Rival Schools, which is another fighting game Capcom made that's something of a cult classic. The name kinda suggests what it's about. Teams of schools having a fighting tournament against each other. Batsu is considered the main character and plays similar to your average shoot-up character. A Rival Schools character, Akira, was added to Street Fighter V a while ago too, so it could be fun to have it come back with more than just an appearance there. Batsu also appeared in a game called Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, which is similar to Marvel vs. Capcom, but with Tatsunoko characters and some weirder picks. There's a precedent for him getting into stuff like this, is my point. Alright. Next we got two really cool street level heroes who are long past due a Marvel vs. Capcom appearance. Daredevil and Moon Knight. I think Daredevil's pretty self-explanatory since he's one of Marvel's biggest heroes who hasn't made it to MVC yet. His acrobatic nature could be a lot of fun. Moon Knight's a cool hero as well, who got a TV show recently. I could see him being really popular if handled well in the future of Marvel adaptations. I'm imagining he could be a stance fighter, able to change between Moon Knight and Mr. Knight. That's not really how he works in the comics, but it is how it works in the show, and it captures the spirit of his character, so, who cares? Also, he needs an attack where he throws random bullshit. We need an attack that recreates this panel, exactly. There's two new characters to represent Capcom's biggest franchise, Leon and Carl Heisenberg from Resident Evil. Leon has appeared occasionally as a protagonist of the franchise ever since Resident Evil 2, and his most iconic appearance was Resident Evil 4, which surprisingly hasn't been referenced much in crossovers despite its acclaim. The Resident Evil 4 remake was also the most recent game in the series at the time of recording. Leon would probably share a lot of moves with the other protagonists who've been playable in MVC, with lots of grappling moves he could use on zombies and Resident Evil 4 mixed in. Carl Heisenberg is a little bit of a weirder case. He's a villain of Resident Evil Village, and Lady Dimitrescu is the most requested character, but his role is just as important as hers, and I feel he could be more interesting moveset-wise with his magnetism powers. And look at this giant weird robot thing, that's just an amazing super move right there. I have plans to add a couple more Resident Evil characters once we got to the DLC, but since BB Hood is here, most of them will be protagonists because we already have a couple of characters that use weaponry. Nobody on Earth could ever predict this, but guess what? It's a character with stretchy powers. The Kamala Khan version of Ms. Marvel. She's easily one of the most iconic superheroes in recent memory, and this time we're not doing what I did with Moon Knight because she needs her comic accurate stretchy powers and not the stupid ones from the TV show. Back to Capcom, I've also added Phoenix Wright from the Ace Attorney games. Phoenix's appearance in Marvel vs. Capcom 3 was one of the craziest parts of the series. They took a character who doesn't fight at all and gave him a crazy moveset with all kinds of references to his series, and as a big Ace Attorney fan, I want him back. Where was he in Infinite, Capcom? You know what wasn't a mistake in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite's roster? The fact that they added Black Panther. That was a great pick for the roster, and he should absolutely be a lock here too. Black Panther's in. Monster Hunter was another character introduced in that game. They're a character based off the customizable avatars for the Monster Hunter games, with all their tricks from the games. Monster Hunter is Capcom's second biggest franchise, so representing them should be a priority. In my roster, they're also using their design from Monster Hunter Rise instead of the Rathalos armor that was in Infinite, so that a newer game can be referenced. Monster Hunter Rise introduced a grappling hook too, so that would be a lot of fun for an air dash or something. And Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite did introduce both these characters, and Jedha was pretty cool too. Maybe I treated this roster too harshly. Nathan Spencer is back? Never mind. The hour is upon us. Here are the aforementioned lots of X-Men characters I promised. Wolverine, Cyclops, Psylocke, Deadpool, and Magneto. Wolverine is the most obvious one. I was actually heavily debating whether or not to add Cyclops. Look, I'm sorry, I'm not that big of a fan of him, and he did miss out on MVC3, but after seeing how big a deal it was for the fanbase that he was the dude on the front of Marvel vs. Capcom Collection shaking hands with Ryu, yeah, he would be the absolute best character to show Marvel vs. Capcom coming back, and he's way more popular than I realized before. I've also played some of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 to gather footage for this, and he's way more fun than I remembered. I think I need to change my mind about him. Similarly, Psylocke is kinda here for some Marvel vs. Capcom 2 nostalgia points as well, since she's just a lot of fun in that game. And I want to bring back plenty of classic characters in general. Deadpool was in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and he's a very popular character still. He had a lot of moves or just quotes where he breaks the fourth wall and completes a lot of nerds by saying, "It's Marvel, baby," or some fighting game terminology or something stupid like that. Finally, Magneto is easily one of Marvel's most iconic villains, and if we're adding X-Men characters, he's gotta be here too. I just unveiled lots of characters for Marvel, so here's a few for Capcom as well. The next 3 characters come from Devil May Cry, Capcom's big character action series. Dante, Nero, and Virgil. It might feel a tad strange to give DMC 3 characters when some series still have 1, but Devil May Cry's focus on combos and stylishness just feels very suited to the Marvel vs. Capcom formula. Dante and Virgil were both in Marvel 3 and could easily be ported over here with a few changes and some abilities they had in Devil May Cry 5. Nero is a new character for this series, and he's sort of the next generation protagonist ever since DMC 4, so this is a good place for him to shine. Afterwards, I've added another character who's also sort of from a character action game, at least one with a surprisingly robust combat system, Amaterasu from Okami. Okami is a super charming game that was developed by a team at Capcom called Clover Studio, which is kinda like Zelda with a wolf before Zelda with a wolf. Amaterasu was previously featured in Marvel vs. Capcom 3 as well, and surprisingly has a ton of abilities she's able to pull out using her Celestial Brush abilities. Amy was one of my favorite characters to use in that game. I never said I wasn't biased. Afterwards is a character that comes from a game released the same year but on different hardware and is about as different as you could possibly get. Frank West from Dead Rising. Once again, he's a character with some fighting game crossover experience and war experience. Frank West is a survivor of a zombie apocalypse that happened to be at a mall, so he mostly attacks with random bullshit that gets even more random than Moon Knight. Shopping carts, baseball bats, laser swords, and a camera to take questionable photos with. Those are just parts of his arsenal. The Guardians of the Galaxy are a mainstay Marvel series now, thanks to the movies, and Marvel vs. Capcom had a couple of characters known for the team. Specifically, Rocket Raccoon and Gamora. In my roster, I've decided to add the guy that's now the face of the team thanks to that movie, Star-Lord. He would have moves using his jetpack and make use of his elemental guns, which are able to shoot any of the 4 elements. That gun may be underutilized in the movies, but that doesn't mean it has to be in a fighting game too. Back to Capcom, there's one series in particular that's pretty big for them. They've never really been able to put in a crossover like this. I want to finally rectify it by adding a character, Date Masamune from Sengoku Basara. It's essentially Capcom's version of Samurai Warriors, and Date is the protagonist. Hey look, it's another franchise with combo-heavy action. You could work perfectly. The series is big in Japan, but never got much success in the West. Most of the games never released there, which is presumably why it wasn't in Marvel vs. Capcom. And well, I've already added a character from a series that hasn't gotten an entry since 1995. I'm not drawing the line at characters who weren't popular in America. And now we are finally at the last Marvel character of the base game, Shang-Chi. Shang-Chi is a bigger hero than you might realize in the comics, and could prove to be very important to future MCU movies once he returns and stuff. It would also be very cool to see a Marvel martial artist facing off against some of the Street Fighter cast, not unlike Iron Fist in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. And then the final Capcom character, yet another one from a cult classic game with stylish combat, Asura from Asura's Wrath. This game's scope makes Devil May Cry look tiny, and a godlike cosmic character is definitely fitting to Marvel's tone. I see him requested a lot from Marvel vs. Capcom, and his series even had a sort of parody of a fighting game at one point. You know, over the course of making this roster, I kind of found the Capcom side to give me just a little bit more breathing room than Marvel in terms of characters. Like, I could add more cult classic characters with Capcom than Marvel. Maybe it's just because Capcom's list of series they still regularly support is getting slimmer and slimmer, but I just found them easier to make rosters for, and I could still add more characters who didn't get a chance to be in crossovers yet. Well, anyways, we might be missing a bit of faces, that would be nice, but I think we have a solid base game roster. Lots of new characters and some weird picks. Here's our base game roster for Marvel vs. Capcom 4. Wait a minute. Okay, I never bothered to give this game a name. Well, I've been calling it Marvel vs. Capcom 4, and yes, that's what I want to call it, but it needs a subtitle. The first Marvel vs. Capcom game was Clash of Superheroes, then New Age of Heroes, and Fate of Two Worlds. Even though, there's obviously more than two worlds in this game. Well, okay, I'm gonna say the laziest possible subtitle, alright? You ready? Marvel vs. Capcom 4, Return of Heroes. I don't think it's my most creatively inspired idea yet, but it does the trick, signaling a big return to the franchise, and a return for many of these heroes, doesn't it? Here's a base roster for Marvel vs. Capcom 4, Return of Heroes. Now, I fully intend to add some DLC fighters, don't you worry about that, but Marvel vs. Capcom is just a big series, and this is already turning out to be such a long video, so screw it, I can discuss some stages too. Most games have either pre-existing or original locations for stages, but Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite had a pretty interesting idea, mashing up locales from two sides of the crossover. I like that, but I do think there's still lots of iconic locations and concepts that haven't gotten a stage yet, so I would prefer a more traditional method here. That said, I'll try to play up the multiversal aspect just a little bit more, because I think it could be fun to see more stages that are variants of the normal locations to add a little bit of spice. I mean, the Days of Future Past stage was cool in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Let's add more things like that. Maybe we could sneak in some crossover aspects if we do this too. There's 5 per side for a total of 12 stages. My first idea for Marvel is the Dark Dimension. It's based on a location from the Doctor Strange comics and would have all the crazy funky visual effects from that medium with the dark atmosphere the movies gave it. The Latverian Embassy acts as a sort of hideout for Doctor Doom, and it's a stage here. It would mostly be in front of the palace-like building. Maybe we could have some Doombots patrolling around it as well, and yes, this is our obligatory stage set in New York. Asgard was a stage in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, so here let's bring it back with a twist. I'm calling it Ancient Asgard. It's a look at what the city was like when it was under construction. We could see the massive palace half finished, a young Odin, and an army of dwarves constructing the buildings for the Asgardians in the background. This is what I mean by more multiversal concepts, by the way. I just want to have stages with more twists on already known locations. Speaking of which, I mentioned the Days of Future Past stage. That was one that showed a post-apocalyptic scenario based on that X-Men storyline. But for this stage, I do want to bring this post-apocalypse to another location to the X-Men series, Krakoa. Basically, the concept of this stage is similar to what happened in Days of Future Past, only the mutants are now living in Krakoa at this point, like the modern comic books, and the Sentinels wage all-out war against them. The lush jungles would be completely on fire as the Sentinels patrol, and X-Men characters who didn't quite make the cut for playable spots could cameo as hiding from them. Unfortunately, I don't think that iconic poster would quite make sense to put here. And finally, the inside of Stark Laboratory is the final stage. I'm envisioning this as the place where you fight Superior Iron Man for the final boss, but it could work as a normal stage as well, complete with Iron Man's tack all over the place. In the boss, the stage could also get more and more destroyed over time. Also, the Danger Room should return as this training stage because it was genius to have it be a training stage, and it should be in every single Marvel vs. Capcom game ever now. Moving on to Capcom stages, here's where my ideas get a little bit more high concept. The first idea is the Lair of Fallen Kings. This is essentially a version of the Lair of Four Kings from Street Fighter V, set after Bison's defeat. The lair would be in complete disrepair after Shadowloo's collapse, with the four faces gone. Eventually, the lair would get more and more infested with zombies until a statue of Albert Wesker from Resident Evil's face is put up there, and this stage would be entirely worth it to see that. Umbrella's taking over Shadowloo now. Afterwards, I want to add Taiyo Academy, the school Batsu fights for in rival schools. The characters would mostly fight in the Sandlot area outside of the school, which I guess all Japanese schools have. However, this stage's twist would be that it's set in an alternate timeline, or a future, where, thanks to our evil Iron Man, Stark technology has now completely taken over people's way of life. Stark-branded robots teach classes visible through a window, they build extensions to the school, and fly through the city on patrol. This is a bit of an odd concept, but the original Superior Iron Man storyline involved him building up a reliance on technology in society before showing his evil ways, so this could be an interesting thing to show in one of the stages. Even Japan's not immune to American billionaires' influence. And then, well, obviously, I gotta add the court from Ace Attorney as a stage. A fairly popular idea, but one that would be incredibly cool. It would be quite the simple visual, basically just the court from the initial Ace Attorney trilogy, but there's lots of cameos to be had. The judge would be in his normal place, Larry Butt's on the witness stand, and any of the defense attorneys beside Phoenix or the prosecutors could be on their respective sides too. And the cameos could switch each time you play. Maybe even Matt Murdock could be defending someone if Daredevil isn't being played, and She-Hulk could be the prosecutor. If we are doing this, we gotta get some obscure Marvel villains to be on the witness stand too. You know, is it just me, or have some of these stages been a little bit cynical? What if Krakoa was burning? What if Wesker took over Shadowloo? What if Taiyo Academy was completely reliant on Tony Stark's technology? This next idea takes an evil group and makes them good. It's called Happy Demon Village. It's a village from the world of Okami, only a bunch of demons have decided to live in peace and harmony. We could show demons from Okami, Devil May Cry, maybe even ghosts and goblins or Onimusha living together in peace. Capcom has a lot of games set in ancient Japan, and lots with demons, so it could be a bit of nod to all of them in a way. Also, Marvel vs. Capcom 3 already had a stage called Demon Village, but I don't get why it was called that in the first place. When I look at this, I think, oh yeah, that's Ghosts and Goblins level 1, not a demon village. And finally, for the last stage, I wanted to give one to Monster Hunter, but the problem was that I am not really a fan of the series. I have played Monster Hunter 4 though, and that game starts with you on a giant ship. I later found out that the Great Sea is a location in the game, and I thought, yeah, that sounds cool. The Great Sea is the stage. Players are on a boat in a stormy sea. There weren't really any stages besides this that are set in at night, at least in the way I was envisioning them, so this could add some variety, and maybe some sea monsters could show up. Well, I don't actually know if Monster Hunter has sea monsters, but I will assume it does, because the Great Sea is a location, after all. Now, our hunter has a design inspired by Monster Hunter Rise, but that game's hub world is clearly an ancient Japan-inspired area, so that might have some overlap with the Demon Village if I were to add it instead. So now that I've gotten the stages out of the way, let's move on to DLC. I have 14 characters, so 7 DLC spots per side. I have also added a bonus wave after it with the same amount of characters. I'm doing that second wave mostly for fun, since even after my initial DLC wave, there's a lot of characters I want to add, but I doubt it would happen, because 14 characters for DLC is already a lot, and a lot of the roster of this game in general has been pretty damn big. I mean, this'll put us in the 70s. My first 2 characters are ones that have basically already been spoiled, Iron Man and Albert Wesker. I've already made it clear why Iron Man is being added to DLC. I do stand by the fact that him missing the base game could be interesting, but once we're adding characters post-launch, it's his time to shine. Just please don't reveal him before the game launches, Capcom, that would get someone angry. And yes, Superior Iron Man can be a premiere costume for him. Wesker is one of the most iconic video game villains of all time, and the first Resident Evil character in my list who was actually in Marvel vs. Capcom before. His design would be based on Resident Evil 5, where he's all superpowered and mutated. If there's to be a story mode in this game, I would love to have him play the role of a secondary antagonist, because he's so ridiculous and iconic in Resident Evil 5, but is dead now, so any crossovers present a way for him to show up again and be all villainous and stuff. It is my sincere belief that every Marvel vs. Capcom roster, or every fandom-based fighting game roster, needs a character that makes general audiences say, literally who? And of all the Marvel vs. Capcom characters I have chosen, they've all been in at least one movie or MCU show. So let's make someone say literally who. Here's Swordmaster. He was created for a Chinese webcomic in a collaboration between Marvel and NetEase, and was later incorporated into the Marvel main comic book line. He later took on the mantle of Iron Fist, so some of the moves could be incorporated here, but it would mostly be based on his original character conception. He uses a magical sword to attack, which can allow him to fly or summon green flames as projectiles. Sounds like an MVC character, alright. I don't know much about the character, but he seems moderately successful, and I like the idea of adding a pretty recent character to a crossover. He debuted in 2018, which might be a while, like 5 years ago, but I don't want to think about how long 2018 was. This next Capcom character is pretty obscure too. Jean from God Hand. It's an action game that's famous for reviewing poorly at first, but now basically anyone who's played it loves it. Its lack of re-releases really made me wish PS2 emulation was easier. Jean is a popular candidate for an MVC spot and another cult classic character that's nice to have. Afterwards, it's Thanos, and look, I know I've said some variation of the phrase one of the most iconic villains like 3 times now, but Thanos really is one of the most iconic villains in cinema, almost entirely due to Avengers Infinity War, and has become one of the most well-known Marvel characters because of it. He was the boss of Marvel Superheroes, the predecessor to Marvel vs. Capcom, and of course had to return for Infinite's MCU-like roster, so he has some history with the franchise. I also think Thanos' palace from the Infinity Gauntlet storyline would have made for a killer stage. It was the final stage in Marvel Superheroes after all, but it didn't make it in though, just because Thanos was not a base game pick. Shut up about the Dark Dimension. Don't worry though, because Capcom also gets a bald villain. Sigma, the overarching antagonist from the Mega Man X series. Also another character who wasn't infinite. And hey, it wasn't a bad choice, even if 3 Mega Man X characters might have been a bit much. I have 3 Mega Man X characters, technically 2, but if you've been paying attention, you should be able to tell why that's different. Sigma's had numerous boss battles with tons of moves to pull from, and a very cool laser sword. Going back to the X-Men for my next pick, Nightcrawler. There's lots of X-Men who would be good legacy picks, like Storm or Gambit, but I've realized that I don't have anyone with a new moveset, so here's my choice. Nightcrawler is probably the X-Men I've seen the most requests for Marvel vs. Capcom. He's known for some very cool action sequences, and a combat style based around both swordplay and deception. I've seen a lot of people request Edward Falcon from Power Stone for Marvel vs. Capcom, and yeah, that's a great idea, but instead of the main character himself, I'll add this girl, Rouge. Not to be confused with Rogue from the X-Men, to represent Power Stone. Power Stone is a Dreamcast-era fighting game and one of the few 3D fighters Capcom ever made. It's known for a gameplay in a fully movable space with items, making it not unlike a 3D version of a platform fighter. This means Rouge could pull out a ton of items from the games alongside her actual moves from the series, which could make for an interesting character and a good way to represent the series. I chose her instead of Falcon because I find her more interesting as a character, and she was actually considered for Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. The beauty of DLC when making rosters like this is that you get to include not only big characters, not just weirdos, but absolutely broken characters that ruin the competitive scene. Pay to win. So let's add a popular character that's ridiculously strong and can canonically beat up everyone else in this roster. Squirrel Girl. She obviously represents the lighter, goofier side of Marvel Comics, and she's honestly probably one of the most popular recent Marvel characters to not be adapted to anything yet. We already have Deadpool, so, we need more funny characters, and I do think her moveset could be interesting. I've always liked the idea of including a new character from Capcom's early arcade game history in Marvel vs. Capcom, so here's Lancelot from Knights of the Round. It's an arcade beat-em-up themed around Arthurian mythology, and Lancelot would essentially be a swordsman. Although the game lets you ride a horse at certain points, so that could make for some different moves as well. Technically, King Arthur is the main character of that game, but Lancelot's just a bit more speedy, rather than being an all-arounder, so I think he could be a bit more interesting. I promise, we're done with the weirdest picks in the DLC. Well, in the first pass. Doctor Strange is next, a fairly obvious character who missed the base game because they already had a couple sorcerers, and he has been pretty important in the MCU lately. Plus, I did add a Doctor Strange stage already. And then it's Hisenko, a third character from Darkstalkers, and with this we got one character who debuted in each of the 3 main Darkstalkers entries. She's a type of Chinese vampire called the Jiangshi, and I'm pretty much just adding her because she's my favorite Darkstalkers character, but hey, she is popular and made it into Marvel vs. Capcom before. And finally, the last Marvel character of this wave is Kang. I really don't know what the MCU is planning to do with the character now that Jonathan Majors has fired and Doctor Doom is in, but we're gonna ignore those movies for now because I think Kang is a fun, if a little silly villain who could be great in something like this on his own merits. He could have moves where he throws an onslaught of variants at you, and I do think our base roster was a bit short on villainous characters, so we can make up for it now. And then the last character in total for the first wave is Cammy from Street Fighter. Now's the time to give some big series more fighters, and past MVC2, Marvel vs. Capcom never really got many characters who were in Street Fighter 2 games, besides Ryu and Chun-Li. So here's one now. I would prefer to give her Street Fighter 6 design, even though I gave Ryu and Chun-Li their SF2 look, because let's be real, Cammy's Street Fighter 2 design is 100% inferior to her SF6 look. So there's our pass. Once again, this is probably the only DLC this game would realistically have, but I think with the characters it added, it's a more than complete roster. There's still some characters that would be nice, of course, but the base game had some holes and now I think they're fixed. Before I get to the bonus pass, I mentioned the idea of premiere costumes before, so why don't we take a little break and talk more about those ideas. This will just be an informal discussion of some ideas, because I don't think they would do this. I haven't made a shitty MS Paint graphic of this. I've been calling them premiere costumes too, but that's a very already copyrightable term, so let's call them premium costumes instead, so we can pretend it's an original idea. I mentioned Ken earlier as a costume of Ryu, and their movesets do have differences between them, but Smash made Ken work as an Echo Fighter, so he could be fun. It can also be interesting to have Zangief as an Echo of Hagar. Again, a bit of a stretch since Zangief doesn't exactly use weapons from Final Fight, but it could still work, especially since Zangief was in Marvel vs. Capcom before multiple times. And Zangief is very associated with steel factories. I'm sure there's something we could do with Mega Man characters. Maybe Mega Man X's Zero could be added, or Axel could be added as well. Also, I'm begging you, please don't ask for Edgeworth or Apollo Justice to be premium costumes for Phoenix Wright. No, that's too much of a stretch even for me. I've seen ideas for Ada over Leon, which could also work. They were both playable in Resident Evil 4 after all, and Lilith over Morrigan makes sense. I also like the idea of Chuck Green, the protagonist of Dead Rising 2, over Frank. It seems like an obvious one. Dead Rising is a big series, but it's kinda hard for it to get multiple characters since the protagonists are pretty similar to each other, so this might actually be the ideal way to do it. That was 6 characters for Capcom, so I suppose I'll come up with 6 for Marvel as well. Marvel has way more variations of characters, so it could easily get lots of premium costumes. Seriously, I really don't think it would be hard to come up with 50 Spider-Man variants without looking it up if I tried. Ultimate Spider-Man and Superior Iron Man were the ideas I mentioned before, and another obvious one is US Agent for Captain America. He's a different guy who used to be Captain America for the time and now has his own identity, mostly acting as an anti-hero. He actually was an alternate skin for Captain America in the first Marvel vs. Capcom, as was Lilith for Morrigan, but it was just kind of the same sprite with a slightly darker color palette. We can do better than that. I do think some characters are fine being referenced just by changing the color of someone else though. Like, Red Hulk does not need to be his own character. Sorry, Red Hulk fans. The Jane Foster version of Thor would also be a pretty cool one. I honestly think she could work over Thor Odinson himself, but I prefer not to since Thor wasn't in too many Marvel vs. Capcom games yet. The Shuri version of Black Panther would 100% work too, and for the final spot I'll add Gwenpool over Deadpool. She might work better as her own character, since it would be a lot more fun if she could use her own gags, but alas, I did not fit her in, and she's so popular that she definitely would be very requested if she's not in this game. Plus, her voice lines being different could set her apart. If you're a Gwenpool fan and are complaining about her not having her own moveset, well, she'll probably have a funny fourth wall breaking joke about it as well. So, we're ready for our final DLC pass. A while ago, before I even thought about making this video, I posted this roster concept in a Discord server. Afterwards, my friend posted their own, and I realized, oh shit, I forgot about Blade. So I said, what the heck, I'll make another DLC season, and thus, Blade was the first character I added to DLC. He's a very highly requested character, and is pretty popular. He's even getting a new movie soon. I just forgot about him, oops. He does kind of feel more like a DLC choice, since he might have a lot of overlap with Moon Knight, moveset-wise, so I wouldn't change anything about the roster, honestly. The first DLC pass choice for Capcom alongside him is Miles Edgeworth, Phoenix Wright's rival. Told you he shouldn't be a premium costume. Edgeworth could use some funny gags like Phoenix Wright to attack, albeit taken a little bit more seriously than Nick, and he could have a gimmick based around the Miles Edgeworth Investigations games. Similarly, I could see Kay Faraday showing up for some of his attacks, the same way Maya Fey does for Phoenix Wright. His sister Franziska von Karma was considered, since she almost made it into Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, but I don't really like that idea very much, because you're really going to add an Ace Attorney character specifically because they have a weapon. Have some fun. Back to Marvel, the next pick is Gambit. And look, I swear this was made before Deadpool and Wolverine came out. Gambit being right after Blade in this roster was a coincidence. He's another popular X-Men that I really associate with the 90s, who could bring plenty of hype here. I associate him with early Marvel vs. Capcom games too. Then it's the fourth character for Devil May Cry, Lady. She debuted in Devil May Cry 3 and has since appeared in most games, even being playable in Devil May Cry 4. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 had Trish as a playable character and story, but Lady is cooler and hotter than her, so she gets it instead. It's just true. Her playstyle is a lot more based on heavy weaponry, which could set her apart just a bit compared to the other DMC characters. Speaking of heavy weaponry, Rocket Raccoon is next. Guardians of the Galaxy needs a second character badly, and so why not him? Rocket and Groot as a duo character could probably be cool, but he already has his own moveset, so that would be important here. God, he must have been such an obscure character in 2011. Also speaking of characters in this game, and also speaking of characters who are shorter than your average fighting game character, Beautiful Joe is next. He's from another game developed by Clover Studio, and isn't it crazy I haven't added a superhero on the Capcom side before? Enough beating around the bush. It's time to add the greatest and most beloved character in all of Marvel vs. Capcom, Shuma Gorath. Part of the reason I chose him was to represent more of the Doctor Strange universe and some more villains. He's a very unique character, but really it's because of his legacy with the Marvel vs. Capcom games. Shuma Gorath first appeared in Marvel Superheroes, and has become a popular character for being in the games, almost just because of how ridiculous he is. Capcom actually fought hard to get him in the roster of Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which is really funny to me and kinda inspiring in a way. I love weird rosters. Marvel probably would have crucified me for multiple decisions here if I was at Capcom and pitched this roster, so I have to keep the Gorath legacy alive. Of course, Marvel doesn't really own the rights to the name Shuma Gorath anymore. They tried to use it for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, but couldn't. I say they should get the license to it anyways, because I think having Shuma Gorath is worth it, but if they want to rename him to Gargantuos like the movie did, sure, whatever. Or not, because, let's be real, they probably wouldn't add him. That said, the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection is using the name Shuma Gorath, so maybe it won't be a problem at all. If they do decide he needs to go, Dormammu could be a good backup option, although I do like the idea of adding Clea, his niece who is in the post-credit scene of Multiverse of Madness, and could bring over some of Dormammu's moves he had in MVC himself. Of course, I would kill a man for Shuma Gorath to be in this game though, if that was what is required of me. Afterwards is Tron Bonne, a side character from the Mega Man Legends series who actually got her own game at one point. She's also a mainstay of the Marvel vs. Capcom games. She fights in a mech and can summon these little robots called Servbots for her attacks. The Mega Man Legends games are big cult classics, and it's just nice to move away from Mega Man X in particular for this roster, I suppose. Marvel Comics are currently in a time where a lot of iconic heroes have next generation iterations of them using their title. Usually I prefer to keep the classic, more recognizable versions of those heroes, but I'm making an exception here for the Kate Bishop version of Hawkeye. She would fight like Hawkeye did in Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and Infinite. I just chose her instead of the classic version of Hawkeye to show off more newer characters, and because of the fact that she's already in the MCU, which makes her more recognizable anyways. I suppose Ms. Marvel was the next generation version of the hero, but let's be real, Kamala Khan's already way more well known for the title than Carol Danvers is. Moving back to Capcom, Lady Dimitrescu is finally making it onto this roster. I mentioned her earlier when saying that most people would probably have chosen her over Heisenberg, and now it's like, yeah, they can coexist. You probably noticed I like pointing out that a character is in fact a villain and a heavyweight whenever I add a villain or a heavyweight. So look, more villain and heavyweight representation. I could see her summoning her daughters for her attacks, and her fucked up evil monster form from her boss fight could make for good super moves. Continuing off the theme of characters that are next generation versions of others, it's Falcon. Not to be confused with Edward Falcon. He should have the design he got after becoming Captain America and with the shield, but I would keep calling him Falcon just because it's slightly confusing with two caps on the roster. He would have a similar move to Steve Rogers, but with his wings and Pet Falcon Redwing, he would have a different, more aerial-based moveset. Oh my god, look, it's another cap. Isn't that so funny? Captain Commando is another early beat-em-up, and the main character of Captain Commando himself is probably the most iconic part about it, due to his MVC 1 and 2 appearances. Although he can summon out the other characters from the game with his attacks, so that's where we get some babyhead representation. I liked him in these games, and I nearly chose to add Strider Hiryu, but I chose him instead since he's never been in 3D before. This is where I'm obligated to say the "Hey, did you know Captain Commando can be shortened to Capcom" fact that every YouTuber always says. I've seen it so many times it might actually be reaching Doki Doki Panic levels. And that brings us to the final two characters. The last one for Marvel is Magic. She's easily the most recognizable member of the New Mutants, which is a team connected to the X-Men that has been around for a surprisingly long time. They even got their own movie, which was the last X-Men movie produced by 20th Century Fox. I swear I've never heard anyone talk about, not even Deadpool mocked it in Deadpool and Wolverine. It wasn't even that montage. Magic herself has, well, magic abilities and is notably able to teleport. She's also the sister of Colossus, and wait a minute, he's an important character in the Deadpool movies. They really forgot about this movie, huh? Deadpool can't even make a joke about how she's too occupied with Mario money to come back. Anyway, sorry for not adding you, Storm. If I had one more DLC character, you would absolutely be the one I pick, though. And finally, I'm getting weird with the last choice. Screw you. It's Miyamoto Musashi from Onimusha. Onimusha is a big series for Capcom, but it's never really appeared in crossovers like Marvel vs. Capcom before. Probably because the protagonists are based off of real-life actors' likenesses. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom had the protagonist of Onimusha Dawn of Dreams, who wasn't based on an actor. Musashi was the protagonist of the new Netflix series, and since he's literally Miyamoto Musashi, he would be a great fighter. Also, he possesses the Oni Gauntlet just like any of the series' protagonists, so he wouldn't feel too different from them. Also, you would assume Musashi debuted in the Netflix series, right? Well, he actually debuted in a video game, and that was Onimusha Blade Warriors. It all comes back to Onimusha Blade Warriors. So that gives us an absurd roster of 72. We're almost at Smash Ultimate numbers. Here you go, brace yourselves. Alkina Dimitrescu, Amaterasu, Asura, Batsu, BB Hood, Black Bolt, Black Panther, Blade, Cammy, Captain America, Captain Commando, Chun-Li, Cyclops, Dante, Daredevil, Date Masamune, Deadpool, Devilot, Doctor Doom, Dr. Octopus, Doctor Strange, Falcon, Frank West, Gambit, Jean, Hagar, Hawkeye, Heisenberg, Hulk, Hisenko, Iron Man, Jury, Kang, Lady, Lancelot, Leon, Luke, Loki, Magic, Magneto, Miles Edgeworth, Miyamoto Musashi, Monster Hunter, Moon Knight, Morrigan, Ms. Marvel, Nero, Nightcrawler, Phoenix Wright, Psylocke, Rocket Raccoon, Rouge, Ryu, Scarlet Witch, Shang-Chi, Shumagorath, Sigma, Spider-Man, Squirrel Girl, Star-Lord, Swordmaster, Thanos, The Thing, Thor, Tron Bonne, Virgil, Beautiful Joe, War Machine, Wesker, Wolverine X, and Zero. Versus Capcom is a big thing. Like, it's a huge beast. A discussion on games... Oh, Beast would have been a nice character. Discussions on new games can be some of the biggest sources of hype ever. It's very interesting to see roster concepts too, because I think they can show a lot about how a person thinks about Marvel vs. Capcom. For example, I haven't read that many Marvel comics, for example, which might change how I think about these rosters compared to someone who's a big, die-hard Marvel Comics fan. Plus, I think for me, the Marvel vs. Capcom series is so big, it's kind of changed how I see a lot of the characters who made it into the games. And my perception of, like, the X-Men, for example, was shifted by this series, since I haven't had that much X-Men experience compared to Spider-Man or the Avengers, at least as a kid. God knows I didn't know what Cyberbots was before MVC. Anyway, there was a ton of fun making this ridiculously long video on my concept for Marvel vs. Capcom 4 and sharing my ideas. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later, and I'm going to stop now before I think of a third DLC pass. Swordmaster, Thanos, The Thing, Thor, Tron Bonne, Virgil, Beautiful Joe, War Machine, Wesker, Wolverine X, and Zero. God, that was perfect! Oh, I think I deserve some. All in one try. You know what? I'm sorry. This is not making it in the fucking video. Marvel